What is up, people of Middle-earth? Welcome to my The Lord of the Rings of Power finale breakdown, recap, and review. So clearly I've got quite a lot to say in this episode. We finally got the reveal of Sauron and also the Stranger, of which I think most people were right all along. I want to get into those main reveals, discuss what this means for the lore of the show in this adaptation, where things can be going in the future. It's weird to say that because we obviously know in a way where things are going in the future, but there have been some differences with the forging of the Rings of Power and how certain things unfolded in this adaptation. So right at the beginning, oh man, they're really trying to sell to us that the Stranger is Sauron. And from the get-go, I mean, I'm not saying I'm a smart ass or anything, it's just it was obvious that the Stranger, from when the Mystics found him, wasn't Sauron. Except we were right in thinking that these three Mystics were locating Sauron. To be honest, I feel like this show does leave certain things out, and I will get to some more things later, but one of them here is I would have liked a bit more story or like explanation as to why these Mystics felt like Sauron fell out the sky. Now Sauron, after Morgoth's defeat, carried on experimenting with the unseen world. So it's like, what were these Mystics doing at the time? Did they not wonder where he went for those 5 centuries that Galadriel was hunting down Sauron? So just things like that. I'm just wondering why they thought that it was him. This is when the Harfoots arrived, and I was kind of glad that the Mystics got to him first, because I was saying at the end of my last review, I was a bit worried that somehow they would get there before literal Mystics. There were certain moments where I did feel like, and I know, to be fair, there is a defense to be made, as much as some of you people who really don't like this show might lay into this, that Hobbits, Harfoots if you will, Hobbits do have a lot of courage and heart and whatnot, but even I in this moment was thinking when the Mystics were going after them and like they were like waving them off, I was like, really? You could just obliterate them just like that. Sadok gets a knife in him, yet, you know, a few minutes later just pops up and stabs one of them in the foot. I can't argue with that in a way, because arguably he was wounded, obviously stabbed, so he could have crawled his way around, but the convenience and contrivance of moments like that, I do feel like was a bit apparent in these scenes. Now, Gandalf says that they showed me what I am, and before that, one of the Mystics says to the main Mystic, make him see. So whatever power they were going to use, or spell, if you will, to unveil the identity of Sauron within himself must also apply to Gandalf here, which I guess I'm fine with, because if that worked for Sauron and would have kind of made him come into his own, it would have that same effect on an Istari falling down to Middle-earth and kind of not remembering why he was somewhat sent here. I guess that's why we had Gandalf come into his own a lot more, be able to talk a lot more, and obviously there was even some Gandalf lines. To Shadow, I bid you return. He had the main Mystic staff, the one that everyone calls Eminem or whatever. We had White Light come out and exposed in a very similar way to the Nazgul, their kind of spiritual underneath. We had them turn into moths, which was another heavy pointer to the Gandalf direction. Obviously, they didn't say the name Gandalf, but if it wasn't clear by now, this is Gandalf, just like what we theorized about, and not just me, a lot of people back in the first episode even, that the Istari could be sent down a little bit early. And again, with this adaptation, from my personal opinion, I know this alienates a lot of Tolkien lore fans out there. It doesn't bother me so much, because with regards to condensing down the timeline of this show, there already has been a lot of changes. For example, when Isildur is born, the Rings of Power, you know, were forged 1500 years before that. Yeah, they've put Isildur into this show. So when looking at a show to make, unless you're really going to explore centuries and then thousands of years, technically speaking, you're going to have certain characters die. So as much as I do understand, and I don't disagree, and this isn't me trying to cater to everyone, by the way, it's just honestly my honest opinion, that some people have massive issues with certain lore adaptation changes. I do understand from a certain perspective the way that they are making the show, because it's very hard to tell a story over the many hundreds and, as I said, thousands of years that they're trying to tell. For example, with the events leading up to Numenor, that's in year 3,300 and something, and considering that the Rings of Power were forged in, you know, the year 1,500 and something, and then the One Ring around 10 years later. Sure, I know that many Tolkien fans would be like, nope, you still have to adapt it that way, but what we're going to do, have Sauron wait around 1500 years. But then again, I know certain fans will be like, yeah, but that's the way it's done. You should tell it that way, not in such a condensed period of time. But all I'm trying to say is I understand that they want to make it a little bit more fluent. The story in more flux is a bit more fluent than the way Tolkien did his story. And that's no bashing on our Lord and Savior Tolkien, obviously. What I'm saying is Tolkien had very, 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 very large stretches of time in between significant events in what story we're exploring in this show. So all I'm saying is I understand why you might bring Gandalf down a little bit earlier. So this is where Galadriel and Halbrand arrive to the elves, Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, and obviously Elrond. And once again, this is just me, it's subjective. I don't mind, personally, that with this show's adaptation, I wouldn't say keep people on their feet, because everyone kind of figured it out, even though there was a bit of entertaining of multiple theories, that this version of Anatar was done through Halbrand. Sauron is a shapeshifter, right? Even though it is different to the lore, instead of this handsome elf, if you will, who befriended the elves. But there are much bigger changes with regards to the forging of the Rings of Power later on in this episode than even, I would say, than Halbrand, or should I say Sauron's appearance in this show. It could be that they might not be able to use the word or name Anatar, by the way. I think someone may have mentioned that to me in the comments with regards to the rights. They have certain rights for this show, but not so much with Silmarillion references and whatnot. But they could have also just wanted to do it for the plain reason of, hey, we're still going to do Sauron, we're still going to have him go to the elves, meet Celebrimbor, but to keep the show a little bit more entertaining in a fresh way, just like many adaptations out there that are beloved by many fandoms, they try and make an effort to innovate, to keep things a bit fresh, at the risk of alienating the existing fandom, of course, which perhaps, as we found out here, many people would have rathered Anatar, I guess. But in so doing, they did it through Halbrand. It didn't alienate me so much, but again, let me know your thoughts on that, because perhaps it did for you, and I would love to know why. As soon as Celebrimbor said who goes there or whatever, and we had Halbrand being interested in him as a smith, yeah, it was very obvious what was happening. When asking Celebrimbor what he's trying to do with the gems, he said that Fëanor's jewelcraft managed to capture the essence of Valinor, and he hoped to do the same for Middle-earth. And that's actually what Anatar did in the lore when he came to the elves. He essentially offered them the knowledge that they could change Middle-earth with the light of Valinor if you kind of do it this way with the knowledge that I've got, the Rings of Power. And they were like, oh, okay, So obviously some differences here, because the elves have already got that mission on their minds with the rot on the tree that Gil-galad noticed. And it's just that Halbrand in this adaptation, Anatar, if you will, gives them the gift or the idea of a way of doing that. And this is what makes Celebrimbor very happy. And of course, Halbrand says, call it a gift. When Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Elrond were talking about the way they can do it, Celebrimbor basically says to everyone there that Halbrand's idea is the key to unlock the dam. And this is where Galadriel gets very suspicious, because he says we're on the cusp of crafting a new kind of power, not of strength, but of spirit, not of the flesh, but over flesh. It's like, I've heard those words before from Adar. And he goes on to talk of the power of the unseen world. And again, that's exactly what Adar said Sauron was doing. And this explains again, as we theorized, why Halbrand wanted to drive that spear through Adar, because I guess during his time and research away, as we went over, Adar was really pissed that Sauron kept sacrificing orcs in his experiments and whatnot, and maybe he did actually wound Sauron or did something, split him, as he described it, to Galadriel, and it kind of set him back a little bit, because maybe he didn't expect that from Adar. This reminds me to talk about Adar very quickly. We didn't really see him this episode. He's in Mordor. We know that Sauron is now going into Mordor at the end of the episode, so I guess we're going to get to see them interact. I wonder what's going to go on there. And so everyone gets to work. Galadriel is mightily suspicious looking at Sauron, and so Galadriel goes off to consult an elven lore master, I guess you could say, on the history of men. While that was happening in the background, we had Halbrand talk with Galadriel, and this was a little bit of a dancing around what's going on here. He's very happy with what's going on. I did enjoy it when he said someone like me working with the elven smiths of Eragon, and I was just like, he's saying that because someone like me, I'm Sauron, the Dark Lord, and I'm here with the elves. I can't believe it. He also goes on to say that you pushed me to heights that no one else could have, and he will never forget that, and he will see to it that no one else does either, which I felt like was a bit of rubbing in the sense that even if she doesn't join him as he kind of wanted her to later, he's always got to have it over her head that she allowed him. Just like how they foreshadowed all season long, the very evil that Galadriel was seeking out could come to fruition through her mission of seeking him out, which kind of did happen. Now this is when we go to Numenor. We have Elendil's daughter being spoken to by Farazon, and other apprentices about, crafting the little tomb that the king will stay in with his likeness. This leads her to go up to the tower to look at the Palantir. What I found interesting about this is it felt like maybe we were meant to get like an episode or two more this season, because there were certain scenes like this, or for example with Elendil and the Queen, and they were going to Numenor and they realized that the black flags had been raised because the king had died at this point. It just felt like there was more story to be given here, because we never saw what Elendil's daughter saw in the Palantir. At the same time, obviously that can be easily argued, we're meant to see that next season, but again, it just felt like there was meant to be a little bit of, not necessarily like a full circle to what she saw, but a little bit of a continuation to be like, okay, but instead it just kind of showed what felt like half a scene and then kind of cut it off from there on out. What was also interesting about the Queen and Elendil scene is that Elendil seems to have recommitted himself to being faithful, being one of the faithful as Queen Muriel goes over, is that there's a bit of a price to pay. Thus, Elendil says, then what little choice do we have but to keep serving? So it's nice to see that Elendil has kind of come back around, because he had such disdain and frustration and borderline hatred looking at Galadriel and regretting saving her. Back with Celebrimbor, there's a little bit of an explosion in the tower because they're tackling it a bit wrong. And of course, Halbrand comes up with the right answer after hearing Galadriel saying, perhaps you're pushing yourselves too hard. But this is when we have Galadriel look at that scroll, and she's, we cut to this scene where she's completely zoned out. She confronts Halbrand by saying there is no king of the Southlands or the Southernlands. And so this is when a bit of the back and forth happens. Galadriel's kind of backing away in a bit of fear in the sense as she's learning who this person is. She says, but you convinced Muriel to go to Middle-earth, and it's like, well, I wanted to stay in Numenor, which is true, which is probably because Sauron felt like maybe he could accomplish more there with their smiths, which is why he was so fascinated by them in Numenor at the time. We can't forget the reason why he's so elevated because of Galadriel is because he had given up. We had Adar basically stab him in the back, and he'd basically given up, but now he's been risen to new heights thanks to Galadriel, as he said. And this is when he reveals, I have been awake since before the breaking of the first silence. In that time, I have had many names. Galadriel tries to swipe him with the dagger, but this is when she's put into a bit of a mindscape, and we have Sauron trying to kind of woo her or seduce her over to like, look, I know what you think of me, but just give me a chance to explain through appearing as Finrod, through going back to the lifeboat raft, if you will. Just let me try and convince you that I'm trying to heal Middle-earth. You could also be my ruling queen. Again, with the name Sauron the Deceiver here, even though you could look at it in one way where he's being honest, I do believe he is still deceiving when he says things like, when Morgoth was defeated, it was as if a great clenched fist had released its grasp from my neck. I do believe he's telling the truth there, but only out of like, okay, when that grasp was released from his neck when his master died, it just meant that he could elevate himself to a higher power. And he says that he could feel the light again, and he knew that if he was ever to be forgiven, that he had to heal everything that he'd helped ruin. But the thing is, Sauron evaded the judgment of the Valar in the lore. I mean, he was meant to go back to Valinor to be judged, but out of being fearful of what potential consequences could await him after, obviously, the whole Morgoth stuff, everything he did lay to ruin with Morgoth, he felt as though it could be pretty dire for him. So you could look at it like he almost repented, but out of that fear, he went into hiding and basically kind of went back to his old ways. But you could look at it in the show as though if he feels like he brings peace to Middle-earth with Galadriel, maybe is the way he's pitching here. And even though Galadriel poses the whole, and I like this line, save or rule, and Halbrand / Sauron says, I see no difference. That is the difference between what he just doesn't get. I do feel like the show could be showing that Sauron, even though he avoided the judgment of the Valar, he might want to prove it in another way here, but ultimately his way of things is dominion, ruling in a bad way. So to be honest, I really did enjoy this scene with Galadriel. Obviously, it's been cooking for a long time now. He even shows a reflection in the water about what they could be together. He does recognize Galadriel's greatness, and again, that is somewhat true to the books in how he did feel as though there was one proper foe for him, and that was Galadriel. I do like the homages, the tribute, if you will, of the lines when he says, "I would make you a queen stronger than the foundations of the earth," which is perhaps a line that you recognize of when Frodo was before Galadriel, just before she passed the test of not taking the One Ring. And this is where it got into a bit of a shouting contest. We have Sauron say, "What will they do when you tell them that you are my ally? When you tell them that Sauron lives because of you?" Galadriel is just like, "And you will die because of me." And his eyes change into kind of Sauron's eye, the little split down the middle, if you will. Now, I do still, again, feel like there's some things left out. It's just like, okay, what happened to Sauron and why was he floating on that raft? I guess, was that because of Adar? He was basically not stripped of power, but maybe weakened, and again, he'd given up. We have lines referring to how he's so thankful for Galadriel getting him to the elves and Celebrimbor, because it's raised him and given him hope again. They can basically do what he's always wanted to do, of which Adar somewhat foiled his attempts at. So, was he just kind of after Adar's, assassination attempt, just wandering the lands? I don't know. We have no idea, really. Like, he was just floating around. But either way, through striking him in the dreamscape on the little raft, she wakes up in the water. Elrond finds her, and I was thinking at this time, tell him that Sauron's returned. This is what I think some people are gonna have quite a bit of an issue with, because Galadriel doesn't reveal it. I do feel like there are motives that the show is trying to give in this moment, even though Elrond, I guess, gets a bit suspicious when he goes back to find the scroll a little bit later on, realizing that the line was broken, so who was that guy? This is where some of the lore changes happen in a way of speaking with the Rings of Power. So Celebrimbor says, "Should we proceed?" And this is where some fans are saying, why would Galadriel proceed when this is obviously clearly some kind of trap? So she says, no, we must make 3. So the 3 elven rings of power. 1 will always corrupt, 2 will divide, but 3, there is balance. And I think this is the show's way of basically adapting the lore of, even though in this version of events, Halbrand, Sauron, is aware that they probably are going to make rings of power, or perhaps at least 2, that through creating 3, there is a bit of balance rather than 2 being corrupting. But that doesn't really matter, because if Sauron creates the One Ring, they are still bound to the One. They are technically accurate when Galadriel says the powers we forged here today must be for the elves alone, untouched by other hands. So an argument could be made that, just like in the lore, Celebrimbor made the Rings of Power. 9 for men, 7 for the Dwarven Lords, and then 3 for the elves. But those 3 were made separately from Sauron, whereas the other 9 and the 7 were made with Celebrimbor and Sauron working together. It's just that, whilst he was working with Celebrimbor, he kind of perverted the process unbeknownst to Celebrimbor. It's just that even though Celebrimbor made those 3 in secret and Sauron wasn't aware of them being made, they are still bound to the One Ring, even if they're in the number of 3 with this balance, as Galadriel says. And even though Sauron in the lore didn't know of them being made, when he put on the One Ring, he knew and detected that, oh, there's 3 elven rings. And when Sauron put on the One Ring, by the way, the reason why the elves weren't bound or corrupted by Sauron is because they also detected that Halbrand, or should I say Sauron, had made a One Ring, and, it made that connection, so they took them off up until Sauron's defeat at the hands of Isildur, and then after the One Ring was lost, that's when they put him back on again. So it's kind of unclear what the show is doing here, because in the lore, once again, Sauron didn't know that Celebrimbor made 3 up until he used the One Ring, and that doesn't really matter because, as I said, when he used the One Ring, they were alerted as well and they took them off. But in this show, it's safe to assume that he's kind of aware that they're making at least 2 rings in an effort to bring the light of the Valar to the elves so they don't fade away. So yeah, it's kind of a bit confusing as to how they're executing this going forward. But the next confusing thing is, by this point, the 7 rings of power for the Dwarven Lords and the 9 rings for men should have been created by this point. They were the first to be made, and then, as I mentioned, Celebrimbor created the 3, unbeknownst to Sauron. But now I'm thinking, well, okay, since only 3 rings of power have been made for the elves, how are they going to do that? Because Celebrimbor made the 9 for the men, the 7 for the dwarves, with Sauron in, likened to that of the scenes of what we saw in today's finale. So this is what I mean. From here on out, I feel like there is a massive divergence in lore, because going into season 2, it feels like, okay, 3 rings of power were made for the elves first instead of last and in secret, and I guess Sauron is going to somehow try and make the other rings of power before the One Ring, even though when he's going to Mordor at the end of this episode, that infers that he's going off to create the One Ring. But anyway, he has to create the 7 for the dwarves and the 9 for the men. So I'm wondering if the show in future seasons is going to have Halbrand, Sauron, going to the dwarves, being like, hey, mate, I need some of your mithril. I mean, by the way, we had a little chunk that made the 3 for the elves, but if we have a little bit more, we can create 7 for you, and I need a little bit more as well to create 9 for the men. And considering they were meant to be created in collaboration with Celebrimbor, even though Sauron taints the process, hence binding them to the one that he creates last, the One Ring that is, it's like, well, what the hell are you going to do? I don't really understand. I suppose he's just going to have to get some more mithril to create them, and so that's why I'm thinking maybe he really does go to the dwarves and offers them some kind of assistance. I can imagine how Halbrand Sauron in this adaptation might be like, well, the elves have got a new power now, rings of power. How about we help you create your own? And that way he deceives them and binds them, even though they don't fade in the same way as the men do. And then maybe he has the same proposition for men. Hey, the dwarves have got rings of power. The elves have 3 as well. How about you have 9? And I don't know, it seems so basic, but surely it's going to have to be something like that, considering they're already meant to have been made by now, even before the 3 that were created this episode. But then lastly, of course, we have Nori and Gandalf, and this is where Nori says goodbye, and this goes back to the theory of why I always thought that the stranger was more likely Gandalf, just in terms of it is at least a foundation for how Gandalf became fond of Harfoots, aka hobbits. Now, when not knowing where to go, he says a very Gandalf line. There's a sweet smell on the air this way. When in doubt, Eleanor Brandyfoot, always follow your nose, which is a, nice callback to what he said to Meriadoc Brandybuck. And I'm not gonna lie, like this area, when the camera was, panning over the hill at that point, did remind me of the Shire, even with that tree there. It reminded me of the tree on top of Bag End. Even though the Harfoots are moving out of this area, all the hills in the background as we pan over Nori and Gandalf are very green. So it does remind me a little bit of the Shire, even a little pathway under the hill there. But again, I don't want to read too into that. And that, after a lot of rambling, is the episode. So again, for Rings of Power, I have enjoyed this show in certain areas. I do feel like they were pretty slow and didn't do a great job of the pacing in several episodes, but I do enjoy parts of the show. There are certain choices in terms of adaptation that I don't mind, of which I've already been over, but then there are some that do perplex me, and I just know that certain fans are really not gonna like, and that's fair. That's their prerogative. If they want to see an adaptation where this is, just too much of a deviation for them rather than innovation, as I always say, with adaptations, you should innovate, not deviate, because that leads to alienating. And I feel like certain things, and mostly perhaps with Halbrand, Anatar, which I can kind of look past, but mainly the Rings of Power and the lack of Rings of Power, and the difference is there, considering the 3 rings and everything we went over there were created first, and the others haven't even been. That's got to send repercussions out into the fandom and questions of what the heck are they doing there. In terms of a finale, this has definitely ramped things up for a season 2, but it does make me think and that they need to take into account the season 2 episodes do need to springboard to life a little bit more, as much as there's things to enjoy in various scenes in several episodes towards the beginning of the season. It does feel like to a lot of people, from what I've seen from, subscribers, friends in real life, that they feel like just not a lot is happening. The decent moments, if you will, viewed by a lot of people are way too few and far between. But I do feel like there is quite a bit to enjoy about this show, in the sense of the attempts at innovation they've done, even if it is at the expense of alienating with too much of a change in certain areas. But yeah, I guess I'm just going to have to wait and see where things go in season 2. But we're going to have to wait 2 years for that, I believe. It won't be back until around 2024. I believe they're filming season 2 now. All that's left to say is I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments. What did you think of this season in general? What did you think of this finale? If you're a fan of the deeper lore and you're aware of certain things like I've described in this video, what do you think of those changes? And they're pretty fundamental changes. Got to be reading every single comment, so do comment, leave a like on this video, especially if you got this far. Would always appreciate that. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you people of Middle Earth in the next video. Goodbye.